Hello and welcome to our first ever hydrogen live Q&A. Get ready, hydrogen professionals and enthusiasts. We're about to rip the lid off the hydrogen hype train with a no-holds-barred Q&A. Our guest, none other than the hydrogen whisperer himself, Dr. Lennie Klebanoff from Sandia National Laboratories. Lenny, for the third time, welcome.
Thank you, Arnes. Very, very nice to be with you.
We've snatched Dr. Klebanoff from the lab's depths to spill the secrets of hydrogen tech. This ain't no PowerPoint snooze fest. We're going raw, live, and unfiltered. Here's the deal. We're dissecting the hydrogen beast from head to tail. We're talking storage, transport, and even the regulatory details. Got a burning question? Light the comment section on fire. We're talking this global. LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you lurk, we'll be there. Here's the taste of the topics we're cooking up. Hydrogen storage. We're not just talking tanks here, folks. We're getting deep into the guts of metal hydrides and liquid organic carriers. High pressure storage. Buckle up because we're cranking the pressure up to 700 bar, and don't blink or you might miss an explosion of knowledge. Transport. Forget the pipelines. We're exploring how this volatile gas gets from point A to point B in one piece. Safety. We're not just sugarcoating it. Hydrogen can be a real bastard when it comes to safety. Dr. Klebanoff's got the intel you need to survive. This ain't your grandma's webinar. This is a cold information bath, and you're invited to the front row. So grab your questions, sharpen your wit, and get ready to rumble with Hydrogen Revolution. Dr. Klebanoff's got the answers, but only if you have guts to ask. Let's go with the first question. Why do current hydrogen storage methods require such high pressures and temperatures, and how can we address these issues to make them more practical?
So they actually require, it's an interesting question. The reason, the chemical reason, and by the way, I just want to preface, RNS, everything I'm going to tell you is my own opinion. They don't necessarily represent the views of the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, or even Sandia National Labs where I work, or even people I work with. So I'm just going to give you my own personal opinion. I'll give it to you straight, just like in the introduction. I'll give it to you raw, Ernest. You know what I'm saying?
A
So,
quick disclaimer.
so, the, so hydrogen is H2, so it's the smallest molecule, and it's also I'm always going to flavor what I'm going to give you on the answers with kind of I'm a chemist, I'm a physical chemist and a surface scientist, so I always like to tie it back to the chemical properties. Hydrogen is a non-polar molecule. It doesn't have different elements on the end of it, so it's very small and it's not charged at all. It's very neutral. So when hydrogen molecules come together, they hardly interact at all. Like most liquids, just sort of the molecules are interacting and they kind of like to get together and lower their energy and form a liquid, but hydrogen's not really like that. So you can compress it to get hydrogen in, enough hydrogen into a given space so that you can use it. One of the methods is to just try to cram as much hydrogen in a given space as you can. And there are various pressures that you can use: 250 bar, 350 bar, 700 bar. For those of you like PSI, it's 350 bar is 5,000 PSI roughly, and 700 bar is about 10,000 PSI. So because the molecules are so non-interacting, barely interacting, you can push them with pressure really close together, and it's still a gas. So the reason you go to high pressure first of all, the reason you can go to high pressure and still have it be a gas is because the molecules barely interact at all. And that interaction is also the reason why you have to cool it so much to get it to become a liquid at all. Because you just have to remove all the heat, remove all the heat, remove all the heat until the molecules aren't doing anything else but being next to each other. And then it can become a liquid. It typically does not require high temperatures unless you're using solid state hydrogen storage. So just to conclude what I was saying about high pressure, the only reason you go to high pressure is to try to get as much of the gas into the place where you're going to be using it as possible. If you don't want to use liquid, the storage densities for hydrogen, by the way, in 700 bar hydrogen, the density of hydrogen in the gas itself is 40 grams per liter. In liquid hydrogen, but you have to go to 20 Kelvin to get liquid hydrogen, it's 71 grams per liter. So you can see that high pressure, you can get the molecules close together, but they still kind of, it's still not that, it's still like they like to stay away from each other a little bit more than in the liquid. As far as high temperature, you don't need high temperatures for high pressure storage. You don't like high temperatures for high pressure storage or even for liquid storage. But if you're storing it in a compound, and we can talk more about this, some of these compounds that are used as hydrogen storage materials, as vehicles for like a sponge that can hold hydrogen and then release it, some of those take some temperature to get the hydrogen out of the sponge. And that can be, you'd like it to be around the temperature of the waste heat of a fuel cell, which is around 85, 90 centigrade. But some of the sponges don't cooperate on us, and they need a little higher heat, maybe 200 centigrade or even higher. So temperature really comes into play when you are trying to get hydrogen off of a hydrogen storage material. Again, we can talk more about that. And the only other place it really comes into play is when you're filling a tank with hydrogen and you're kind of compressing it and compressing it and compressing it. And anybody who's ever pumped up a bicycle tire with a pump can notice that it gets hot. That thing gets hot. It's because energy is coming out of you and going into that tire. So the place where temperature comes into play in high pressure storage is you don't want to fill the tanks so fast that they get hot, because some of the tanks have special structural aspects, which we can talk about more, where you don't want to get it hot. And one way around that is use pre-cooled hydrogen. But anyway, that's kind of a first crack at the question, and we can certainly talk more about any aspect of that.
The next question: what are the main obstacles to speeding up the process of storing hydrogen in materials, and how can we overcome them?
How can we what?
Overcome them.
Okay. So the reason people are interested at all in hydrogen storage and materials is really two reasons. One is the hopes that you can get more hydrogen in that space, like I was telling you about before. And the other is that you don't have to use high pressures to do it. Those are like two of the main reasons. And you might wonder, well, how, can you really store more hydrogen in material? And I'll give you an example of why that's true. So I've already mentioned the densities of 700 bar hydrogen. That is, the density of hydrogen in 700 bar high pressure gas is 40 grams per liter. In liquid hydrogen, which you have to work to get, you have to cool everything down, the density of hydrogen in liquid hydrogen is 71 grams per liter. And as an example of a material that can store hydrogen, a material called alane, which is ALH3, aluminum trihydride, they call it alane. So it's ALH3. First thing you notice is there's hydrogen in that thing. The density of hydrogen in alane is like 149 grams per liter. So that's a lot of hydrogen in that thing. So it's more hydrogen than there is in liquid hydrogen, which is kind of amazing. So there are materials that can really get a lot of hydrogen in a given space, and that's what you want. Now, here comes the problems. And there are a number of barriers with using hydrogen in a solid state material. And there are at least 7. There could be more. I call them the 7 deadly sins of hydrogen storage. The first one is that usually you want the hydrogen in the sponge to come out readily. So you want the sponge to hold on to it, but you want the hydrogen to come out readily. And the way you typically do that is to heat it up, as I mentioned. And a lot of materials, it holds onto it too tightly. You need to go to too high a temperature to get the hydrogen off. So that's one problem. The other problem is that often it's very difficult to get the hydrogen back on. Like if you're in a situation where you want a reversible material, that is, not only can the sponge release hydrogen, but the hydrogen can be put back on. Sometimes they don't take the hydrogen back very readily. And the problem with alane, ALH3, is that it actually releases hydrogen very nicely to form aluminum, but it's very hard to get the hydrogen back on aluminum, at least in a setting like where you're using it, where you don't have to take it like to a laboratory and regenerate it. So second problem is the hydrogen doesn't come back on. A third problem is that it doesn't do these things quickly enough. And how fast is fast depends on sort of what you're doing. Uh, like for a light duty vehicle, you want to be able to get the hydrogen off in the course of a week, but you want to get the hydrogen back on the material in 5 minutes. Like you're going to a hydrogen station and refilling your car with hydrogen gas. You want to refill it fast. So sometimes the materials are kinetically bad. They don't release the hydrogen fast enough, or they don't take the hydrogen back on quickly enough. Those are kinetic problems. It may just take too much energy to get the hydrogen off. That's a thermodynamic problem. And so I don't know how many deadly cents I'm up to, but that's 4, I think. Another problem is sometimes materials release something other than hydrogen. And fuel cells are very sensitive to impurities in hydrogen gas. It doesn't like contaminants that can interfere with the function of the catalyst in a fuel cell. So sometimes these materials, they can be complicated, these sponges. They can have a number of different elements. And if they have nitrogen in them, for example, or they have boron in them for various chemical reasons, you can release things you don't want to have released, which is ammonia, like NH3, or like boron, volatile boron compounds. And these will not just poison the fuel cell catalyst, but they'll volatilize your sponge. Your sponge is going away. So you can't have that. So they release other things. And sometimes you just need them to be able to do this reversibly, release the hydrogen, put it back on, release hydrogen, put it back on. That's called cyclability. And sometimes the materials have side chemical reactions which kind of screw up the reversibility. So there are a number of problems. It sounds, Ernest, it sounds so easy. You just need to find a sponge that can store hydrogen and then release it. And do that again repeatedly. It doesn't sound so hard, but when you put all these requirements on it, the acceptable behavior space starts shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Sometimes these things are very expensive. The materials that go in them are expensive, and that's another problem. So, what's the solution to these? Well, and also the other thing I want to mention, I think we're up to 6 deadly sins. Another one is that sometimes the materials are just too heavy, because there's a class of hydrogen storage compounds called interstitial metal hydrides that were developed really in the late 80s and 90s and are beautiful hydrogen storage materials, but they're heavy. So if you have an application where it's too heavy, that you're carrying an anchor, your sponge is an anchor, you're going to have a problem. So there are lots of problems that can come up. So what are we doing about them? Well, the field of hydrogen storage research is, and Arnest, we're going to have a bibliography, right, to this.
Yeah.
So so if I mention any kind of like literature reference or a book or something, don't worry about. We're going to put it in a bibliography that'll be posted online. So I can provide some good references on hydrogen storage. One way around the heaviness, like if you can't tolerate having iron and titanium as your hydrogen storage material because it's an anchor, is using lighter materials, like for example, materials based on, like I mentioned, nitrogen or boron, which are all lighter, or aluminum, which is also light. So there's been a lot of hydrogen storage work around looking at these much lighter elements, which kind of solves the weight problem. But they introduce other problems, like maybe because they're no longer just metals, but they're kind of like covalent materials. Their chemistry is a little more complicated. Intermediates can be produced as you're trying to release hydrogen. Maybe they're releasing volatile materials, like I mentioned. So, but I'd say a big area is in making lightweight hydrogen storage materials. If you don't mind weight, there's some really good ones which are probably suitable for an application. I think I'll stop there and
Yeah.
just I'll mention that we'll put in the bibliography a book I published about 12 years ago, which goes into a lot of hydrogen storage material science, trying to solve the problems that the questioner asked around weight, around avoiding intermediates. That's really just chemistry research, which is being directed to that. And reversibility is gets to trying to understand how these reactions really happen. And there's a lot of R&D, and we can also talk more about it because we have lots of time today to talk about this stuff.
We are going next question, and guys, please ask your questions to comment section, direct message, or info@energynews.biz. Question from Christian Carrier. What about storing H2 in CH4 or NH3?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So what's interesting about this question, and so it's a good question, thank you for it, is so when do you call something just a fuel and when do you call it a hydrogen carrier? Like diesel fuel has hydrogen in it, but they don't talk about it as a hydrogen carrier because you just burn the diesel fuel, right? So when you burn diesel fuel, you're converting the carbon in it to CO2, which releases energy, and you're also converting the hydrogen in it to water, which also releases energy. But nobody would call diesel fuel a hydrogen carrier. I mean, even the most biggest fan of hydrogen storage would not call diesel fuel hydrogen storage. And the same for methane. You can look at methane, CH4, so methane is CH4. If you're burning it directly in an engine, and there are natural gas burning engines. Natural gas, by the way, is 90% CH4 or methane. So it's when I think of natural gas, I think of methane, but it's actually has some other stuff in it too, light hydrocarbons. If you're burning it directly, I wouldn't call it a hydrogen carrier. But you can burn CH4 directly because it burns so nicely. As anybody who, at least in the United States, half of American homes have natural gas in them. So when you have gas cooking, you're burning natural gas. It burns beautifully. So ammonia is NH3. It turns out that it's difficult to burn it directly. And there's a reason for that. So if you're burning, let me explain this. It's kind of interesting. So ammonia is NH3. And ammonia molecules, because they're different, you have different atoms involved, the bonds are charged a little bit, and that charging allows the NH3 molecules to stick together. There's also, and this is a chemical thing, but there's also a lone pair of electrons on the nitrogen, which makes ammonia sticky amongst itself, the same way water is sticky. Water is H2O, and the oxygen has two lone pairs of electrons, which really help bind it together when they get close to each other. So this property of ammonia, which I just told you about, now your audience now knows maybe more about ammonia than most people in the ammonia industry, is that the lone pairs on that nitrogen, which allow the ammonia to get sticky, does two things for you. At room temperature, ammonia is a gas, but you don't have to cool it down very far to get it to become a liquid, only like 30 to 40 degrees. So you don't have to cool it very far, which is good. It makes it easier to use. But the molecules themselves are difficult to separate from each other, so that it's so sticky unto itself that if you inject ammonia into an engine, there's very little vapor produced. It's just liquid, but engines really need vapor to burn. So pure burning ammonia engines, it turns out that they don't work very well. So the way they solve that problem is when you inject ammonia into an engine, you have to inject some hydrogen with it too, like around a mixture of about 80% ammonia to 20% hydrogen. So bear with me. I know this answer is getting a little long. So if you're burning ammonia directly, you have to have some hydrogen with it to burn in an engine. And that's really the way people use ammonia. And is it a hydrogen carrier? Well, yeah, maybe it is a hydrogen carrier because the way they use ammonia, the way people who want to use ammonia use it, is ammonia um, is dissociated in a separate piece of equipment called a cracker. So they squirt the ammonia, which is NH3, into this device, which actually requires some high pressure and temperature. So it takes a little bit of work to do it, but that separates it into nitrogen and ammonia and hydrogen. And then they take that nitrogen and hydrogen and then re-inject, use that with the original ammonia that you're storing, and then use that in an engine, and then it burns quite well. So now, but let's talk about it. So you can kind of think of ammonia as a hydrogen carrier in that way. So let's talk a little bit about ammonia as a hydrogen carrier. So ammonia is, because of the stickiness I mentioned, the NH3 molecules like to react with each other. When it does form a liquid, it forms a denser liquid than like liquid hydrogen, and on a lower heating value basis, ammonia is about half again as dense, or 50% more dense as a liquid than liquid hydrogen on a lower heating value basis. That is the energy you can get out of it. So that's good. That's good that it's more condensed than liquid hydrogen, for example. It's also good that because of the stickiness of the molecules, you don't have to cool it down very much. The tanks are easier. So tanks which hold ammonia, liquid ammonia, they happen to be cryogenic tanks because 40 degrees below room temperature is, you got to keep heat out of it, but they don't have to be so good that you can have kind of a, if I may use the word crappy, RNS, you can get away with a crappy cryogenic tank and still store ammonia. So that's a good thing too. The thing about ammonia as a hydrogen carrier, which I would encourage people to think about, is that the way you make ammonia is you take hydrogen and react it with nitrogen from the air, and you make NH3. So you need hydrogen to make it. And because of that, any of the emissions that are like greenhouse gas emissions or smog emissions that go into, or energy losses that go into making that hydrogen that you need to start to make ammonia, you're only adding to it with ammonia. Because in making ammonia, that is making reacting hydrogen plus nitrogen going to ammonia, that takes high pressures and temperatures, pressures 200 bar and 300 to 400 centigrade. So whenever you have to do something, it usually creates emissions. You have to compress something, or you have to heat something up, you have emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So there's that added amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And also this business I mentioned about, you have to kind of, because of the stickiness of ammonia, you have to kind of mix some hydrogen in there to get it to burn well. That process of cracking also takes energy. It takes a couple hundred degrees and a few hundred degrees centigrade, and also some pressures. So the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, which is sort of the reason we're doing all this stuff, I think can be higher than with just using hydrogen directly, because you're doing this other stuff. You're converting the hydrogen to ammonia, and then you're cracking some of the ammonia to get the hydrogen to burn it. So I've read some studies which indicate that the greenhouse gas, the pathway emissions for using ammonia as a hydrogen storage system are higher, and they can be significantly higher. The only other thing I would say about it is that, and I think most people understand this, is that ammonia is a very toxic material. It's very corrosive. So you're taking hydrogen, which is non-toxic and non-corrosive. I mean, you can breathe hydrogen. And in fact, we're all breathing it out right now. Hydrogen is a product of respiration. So right now, everybody's breathing out some hydrogen at the ppm level. It's non-toxic. You're taking a non-toxic fuel, which itself is not a direct greenhouse gas, and you're converting it to a very highly toxic fuel, and also a corrosive fuel, which itself is a greenhouse gas, although it has ammonia has photolytic properties. So, but there's definitely some things in favor of ammonia as a hydrogen, if you want to look at it as a hydrogen storage material. I think it's just important to look at its properties broadly, like what what are the greenhouse gas emissions really from using it? That is the pathway emissions, and comparing it to other options you may want to consider. Um, it's weight. If you're worried about weight, ammonia as a molecule is much heavier than hydrogen. Um, so it's like, you know, the atomic mass, the molecular mass of ammonia is NH3, so it's 14 plus 3 or 17, and hydrogen is 2, so it's a lot heavier. But the tankage is simpler, and it's possible, I'm guessing, maybe you get some of that weight savings back because that you can get away with kind of a less engineered storage system. So I'm guessing if you looked at the weight, it's ammonia hydrogen storage is probably heavier uh, on balance than using hydrogen, but the tank savings might get you some of that back. Anyway, sorry for that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I wanted the questioner to know that, and also the audience to know that there's sort of lots of, when you look at hydrogen storage materials or liquids, you sort of have to look at the broad picture, like how it's being used, and and what the benefits are to using it, the greenhouse gas, and also maybe the criteria pollutant benefits. By criteria pollutants, I mean NOx and hydrocarbon and so on. The thing about ammonia is that if you're burning in an engine, you're going to have a lot of NOx being produced because the fuel has a lot of nitrogen in it. So if you're burning it in an engine, you can get criteria pollutants from that engine, NOx, but these are often kind of taken care of in after treatments. But it's not like a fuel cell. So burning ammonia in an engine is not like a zero emission fuel cell. So that's another thing to think about. These questions, the questions of, like, I'm not making a recommendation of one over the other. I look at kind of what the differences are, and usually what you want to use really depends on the application. At least I found.
Christian, I hope you are happy with the answer. If you're not, just reformulate and send back.
Yeah, if you're not, yeah, let me know.
Next question from S.A. Sheriff. What are the most promising metal hydrides for hydrogen storage?
So again, it depends on the application. If you don't care about weight, there are if you don't care about weight, there are what are called interstitial metal hydrides, where the hydrogen just is stored in between all the atoms in the metal. There are metallic-based hydrogen storage materials which work great. They're reversible. They don't require too much heat to get off, but they don't store that much hydrogen compared to the weight of what you have. So iron titanium is an alloy that, if you don't care about weight, works pretty good. Lanthanum nickel 5 is another example of that. There are many metals, if you don't care about weight, are really, really good. And again, I can put in the biography some more examples. So iron titanium is one, lanthanum nickel 5 is one. There are many alloys. Ovonic was a company that existed about 20 years ago. They had many kind of multi-component alloy compositions that can involve chromium and nickel and titanium and many, many different types of metals, which are all beautifully tuned to give you the hydrogen purely and with very little temperature and very reversibly. But often so for a stationary application like you're using the material as a way of storing hydrogen somewhere on land. We have lots of space, and it's on a concrete pad. It's just staying put. Metals are good. However, I do have to give a limitation. That is, I mentioned that you can think of these hydrogen storage materials as a sponge, like it releases the hydrogen by heating it up a little bit. But if you have to give it heat to release the hydrogen, when the hydrogen goes back on, it releases heat. So of those two, so you have what's called the thermal management. It can be a problem, or maybe it's just maybe it's an annoyance, or maybe it's just something you do. But all these metal hydride tanks have heat management or coolant pipes in them, where you can pass hot liquid through these pipes to heat up the bed to get the hydrogen to come off. But more importantly, I think you have to pass a coolant through it to take the heat away when you put the hydrogen back on the bed. And it can be a lot of heat. If you're trying to do this in 5 minutes, like people have thought about for cars, it could be a megawatt of power. That's a lot of power. So the thing I want to mention, just as a practical matter about the metal hydrides, is that this business of the thermal management, that is, you have to provide heat to get the hydrogen off, and you have to remove heat when you regenerate the sponge. That has not been demonstrated with large quantities of metal hydride. Sandia had a project in collaboration with General Motors back about feels like 20 years ago, 15 years ago maybe, where they made a bed that stored 4 kilograms of hydrogen, and it turns out that's about this amount of hydrogen you would want in a car. And so that was you demonstrated that could be made to work, but until very recently, that was the biggest metal hydride based bed that had ever been really fully engineered. Currently, NREL is going to be NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, is going to be testing one that stores 500 kilograms of hydrogen. But still, when you think of hydrogen, you think of a kilogram of hydrogen as having about the same energy in it as a gallon of gasoline. So kind of think of it that way. We haven't really even tested these metal hydride beds to like kind of the equivalent of 500 gallons of gasoline. So there's still a lot of engineering work that needs to go on there. So the only other thing I wanted to mention was that if you do care about weight, if you're worried about putting this on the hydrogen storage on a vehicle or a truck or something else, you do start to care about weight. And those all iron ones I mentioned, or the all metal ones I mentioned, like iron, titanium, and lanthanum, nickel 5, are usually too heavy. So you might ask, and I'm anticipating your question, is, well, what about the light ones? What are good ones from there? And I can just mention a couple. If you're worried about weight, you want to get away, you can go to these more covalent materials, which are we call complex metal hydrides. And sodium alanate is one. That's sodium AlH4. So it involves light metals, and it has a lot of hydrogen in it, NaAlH4. And that material can cycle very well. It can produce, like 3.5 weight% of hydrogen, which is an improvement over the really heavy ones. And they're just much lighter. They're lighter. There are some, but it takes a little bit higher temperature to make that work. It takes like around 150 centigrade to get the hydrogen off of that. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. It's lighter, a little bit of a trade-off. You have to get the temperature up. If you can take a little bit higher temperature, then there's a material called, it's a class called Amides. It's LiNH2 plus either LiH, lithium hydride, or MgH2, magnesium hydride. They're called composite materials. And so the LiNH2 holds hydrogen, MgH2 has hydrogen in it. And that actually, can store about 4 times more per mass as these heavy interstitial metal hydrides. That's a good one. It's very reversible, but you need to go a little bit higher temperature. I have to go up to around 200, 250 C. So again, it kind of comes back to, there are some metal hydrides available. It sort of depends on how much waste heat you have available. Can you accept that you have to go to a higher temperature for the amides, that is the LiNH2, MgH2, or LiH? Do you have that waste heat maybe around somewhere? Maybe it's waste heat from an engine. Okay, so no problem. You can go to 250, or maybe you can't. So again, there are good metal hydrides available, but you have to look at how they're being used in the application. What's your weight sensitivity? And also, what's the availability of waste heat?
All right. Next question. Christian is back. Let's talk about electrolysis. What do you think of anion exchange membrane electrolysis?
So I don't know so much about electrolyzers, but I'll tell you what I know. I'm most familiar with the proton exchange membrane electrolyzers. These are uh, electrolyzers that are kind of like PEM fuel cells operating in reverse. Uh, I'm less familiar with the ones based on anion exchange, although I know that they're commercially available. The key is how the ions are conducted within the unit. In a kind of a proton exchange membrane electrolyzer, it's protons that are doing the ion exchange. They are so. I think the electrolyzers. So I'll say a little bit more about the proton exchange membranes, because I just have more experience with that one. They work well. They they you want to I don't know if most people care about energy efficiency, because usually most end users just care about like the price of hydrogen you produce and how much you're getting and whether or not it's green hydrogen or not. If you electrolyze water using a coal-fired power plant electricity, the overall greenhouse gas emissions are pretty bad. But if you're using renewable electricity to do the electrolysis of water, it can be pretty good. So I do just want to mention one thing I don't think most people maybe know about these electrolyzers, is that you're electrolyzing water, and water is it's pretty strong stuff. I mean, like I mentioned before, like I always like talking about the chemistry. Hydrogen is bound to oxygen as H2O, and those bonds are pretty strong. And I mean, you have everyday experience of this yourself. If you boil water, I mean, it's getting to 100 degrees centigrade, but you're not dissociating the molecules. What's coming off is just hydrogen vapor, right? It's just water molecules that have gone into the vapor phase. So even heating it up keeps those molecules. You're not breaking the molecules apart, but in an electrolyzer, you have to break the molecules apart. So it takes about for every unit of lower heating value of hydrogen you get out, that is you make, it takes 2 units of energy to break apart the water molecules. So if you're concerned about using an electrolyzer and what the greenhouse gas emissions are, you need to look carefully at what the energy input is. So for every unit, like 1 joule or whatever, kilojoule of lower heating value of hydrogen you get out, you had to put in 2 of electrical energy. So that's something to think about, because there are emissions associated with that if you're using not 100% renewable electricity. I think the electrolyzers are finding pretty widespread, not widespread use, but there are hydrogen projects which are starting where they're very, pretty reliable sources of hydrogen. But I don't know enough about the alkaline electrolyzers are actually the older technology. And they are found in some hydrogen stations. I don't know that as much about the chemistry or the overall energy input, but I think if you're breaking apart water, you're having to put a lot of energy into it. So the big thing around the electrolysis is what's the source of electricity, so the greenhouse gas emissions, and and just sort of knowing that energy input you have to have it, so you have to make sure you have enough energy. But there are commercial units available. I'm sorry, I don't know more about the alkaline electrolyzers. It's not as popular a technology, I think, just because you have corrosive liquids in them, and so people maybe tend to shy away from that.
What strategies do you propose for increasing hydrogen storage capacity in a controlled and efficient manner?
So if you don't like high pressure gas, which is 40 grams per liter, and if you don't like liquid hydrogen, which is 70 grams per liter, you have a couple options available to you. The metal hydride or the kind of solid state storage, which I mentioned, or these things called liquid organic hydrogen carriers. So For in the metal hydride case, the research strategy, and this was kind of like my own research strategy, is you have to you. I'll put it this way. I've already mentioned this thermal management problem with metal hydrides, that you have to have these cooling tubes going into the bed and out, and nobody wants to do that. It's a pain to do it. It may be expensive to do it. It may have reliability problems associated with it. So if you're going to look at a solid state storage solution, it has to be a home run, in my opinion. It has to be so much better than high pressure storage, and it has to be a lot better than liquid hydrogen storage, in my opinion. So you have to really be focused on, and it may be true that you can tolerate the weight of a very heavy metal interstitial hydride, but I think the materials are already pretty good enough to do that job. So I think to really impact the hydrogen storage density, you got to go to these. You have to figure out the problems associated with these light, what I call complex metal hydrides. Like I mentioned, the problem of rehydrogenating aluminum. Or again, aluminum has twice the storage density as liquid hydrogen, the aluminum hydride, that is. And also related materials, like there are borohydride materials. Like, for example, magnesium borohydride, which is magnesium, and a borohydride is BH4. That's like a borohydride unit. So magnesium borohydride is magnesium with two of these BH4 units on it. So it's got one magnesium, it's got two borons in it, but it's got 8 hydrogens. So that's a lot of hydrogen. The strategy for making that thing work, and the reason it doesn't work, is because when the magnesium borohydride releases hydrogen, you have to heat it up too high. You have to heat it up to 300 centigrade, which is sort of too high. And also, when it releases hydrogen, you tend to form these other intermediates, these other species, which hold onto the hydrogen. They're called closoborians, but anyway. And there's a problem with rehydrogenating it. So if you're only focused, and I'm going to take the questioner literally in the sense that, how do you increase the density? I think you got to go to these, and if you're worried about, by the way, if you're not worried about weight, you can do better than liquid hydrogen. The interstitial metal hydrides have storage densities around 110 grams per liter is achievable. That's better than liquid, which is 71 grams per liter. So, but you can go even higher in density with these compounds, which kind of covalently bind a lot of hydrogen to them, like the borohydrides, BH4. Those have storage densities even in the 140 grams per liter of hydrogen. That's not the density of the material, it's the density of hydrogen in the material. So the strategy for trying to get to those very high storage densities is to understand the chemistry of why these materials sometimes release their hydrogen at too high a temperature. At too high a temperature, and what governs producing side reactions that can sometimes rob you of that hydrogen capacity. Because if the hydrogen is going into a side reaction, it's not giving it to you. And you want it to get it to you, right? So I think the chemistry of these very high capacity borohydrides and trying to understand what governs side reactions is something I'm actually currently working on, and understanding if there may be some additives that can help make the thermodynamics easier, in the sense that the reaction pathways have a lower thermal barrier, a hurdle to get over. If you're only focused on density, storage density, it seems to me that's the way you have to go. But it's a lot easier to getting higher density if you don't have to worry about weight. But a lot of the hydrogen storage material work came out of it's been an international effort, but a lot of it was directed towards light duty vehicles, and there people were worried about weight. And you're less worried about weight for trucks. you are worried about weight for maritime applications of hydrogen, and certainly in aviation, it's a big problem. Uh, but that's the direction. That's sort of the strategy I would follow to getting higher densities. Uh, that's in the storage materials, uh, from the storage material route.
Let's go to next one. Do you think there is a future for the hydrogen internal combustion engine in the transportation sector?
Yeah, yeah, there is. It's the so hydrogen is a fuel. For those of you who may not know it, you can actually burn it in an internal combustion engine. Uh, it has to be a spark ignition engine, it turns out. So there are these two types of internal combustion engines. There's like compression ignition, where the piston just squeezes the air fuel mixture and it just starts burning. Or you have a spark plug, which produces a spark. So the properties of hydrogen are pretty much, if you're just burning hydrogen itself, that is pure hydrogen, you need a spark ignition engine. There's some very nice features of it, actually. Because of the wide flammability range of hydrogen, it turns out in an engine, when you inject fuel and air into it, the mixture has to be flammable. Maybe that goes without saying, but like gasoline, has a fairly narrow range of mixtures of fuel to air where it'll burn, and that's very carefully controlled in an engine. And hydrogen is quite wide. It's like 5% mixture with air to 75%. If actually it's 4% to 75%. So that's quite wide. So this may be getting a little technical, but I think it's important to notice that because of that wide flammability range, you can operate hydrogen engines at somewhat higher pressure, which makes them more efficient, mechanically efficient. So hydrogen engines are typically more efficient than their gasoline counterparts. And Sandia has done a lot of work over the years in this. Chris White, who used to be at Sandia, did a lot of work. The very first hydrogen boat, which was the CMB, made by CMB Tech, actually used a hydrogen internal combustion engine, not a fuel cell. The difficulty with using the hydrogen internal combustion, and also you can burn hydrogen in turbine engines. There's quite an effort at the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy, in the early 2000s, looking at burning hydrogen in turbine engines, which is another type of internal combustion engine. The difficulty, though, comes compared with fuel cells, is that internal combustion engines are not zero emission energy conversion devices. So if you're using hydrogen in an internal combustion engine, you're sucking in air. So you're sucking in nitrogen and oxygen, which is burning. The oxygen is what reacts with the hydrogen. But you can form NOx, and hydrogen engines, internal combustion engines, can have a little bit higher NOx because it turns out that hydrogen engines run a little bit hotter than the temperature of the combustion of the flame is hotter. So it turns out you can get more NOx, which might be a concern for you. It's maybe 10% more, but it's something to think about. But generally, they're not considered zero emission engines. So that's why there's more of a looking at in terms of fuel cells, which are truly zero emission devices. But hydrogen, it can work well. The knowledge exists for how to make a hydrogen engine work well, a hydrogen internal combustion engine work well in hydrogen. If you're okay with having to do after treatments to take care of the NOx problem, it can work fine. It's an older technology. I mean, there are engines that can be specifically designed for hydrogen with all the right materials. Yeah, you have to make sure the hydrogen engine is made of the right materials that resist hydrogen embrittlement, because hydrogen embrittlement is a feature of using hydrogen that some metals, usually they're like iron-like metals, they're called ferritic metals, can suffer embrittlement, that is, if there's some defect in it, which all machine-made, all man-made materials have little defects in them. Hydrogen embrittlement can cause any defect to get bigger and eventually lead to a crack. And so there are materials choices you want to make that avoid that. So in a hydrogen engine, if it's really to work well, you have to use the right materials. But we know what they are. They're 304 stainless steel or 316 stainless steel or aluminum. Those things don't embrittle. So it comes down to a material choice. You have to be careful to make the right material choice if you're talking about a hydrogen internal combustion engine because of embrittlement. But we make Ernest, we make materials choices all the time in life. Like, for example,
Yeah.
there's a reason you use copper wire in your house and not iron wire. If you use iron wire in your house for the electrical wire in your house, iron heats up when you pass electricity through it. So if you're in a house with iron wiring in it, get out of the house. Get out of the house. Or, copper is good for things, but is good for something, but not all things. For example, if, copper doesn't heat up when you pass electricity through it. So if someone for Christmas gives you a toaster made of copper wiring as the heating elements, that person's not your friend. It's going to take a long time to heat the toast up with a copper wire. So I mentioned this business of materials choice because sometimes people can be afraid of it, but we make materials choices in everything, as far as I can tell. So, yes, hydrogen can be used in an internal combustion engine. There's some really good advantages of it. Efficiency. There's some downsides. It's not zero emission. It's NOx. It can be an issue, but you take care of it after treatment. But you have to make the engine out of the right materials.
For everybody out there, don't be afraid to ask questions. We're here for you. Next question, how do you balance trade-offs between storage capacity, reversibility, and speed in the design of hydrogen storage systems?
That's a really good question, and it's I come to the image that comes to mind is an amoeba. You know what an amoeba is? It's like this single-celled creature.
Yeah.
Just kind of oozes. It kind of oozes in every direction. That's kind of how I feel about it. It's like you kind of ooze into the weight issue a little bit, and then you kind of see how you feel, and then you ooze into the speed of delivery. And you ooze into this other area. Anyway, not that I often think of myself as a single cell creature, but it seems like that's what we do a lot in figuring out these trade-offs. It's not easy. The thing that really, maybe I'll just say this. In thinking about the trade-offs, you have to really be thinking about broadly how you're using these things. And it turns out that, and this is actually where, if you as a researcher, so I'm a researcher doing this stuff, I've also done projects where I've had my hands on the technology, or I built something that a hydrogen device that got actually used. And until you actually use it, you don't really know the sort of the limitations around using them, which come into the trade-offs. So let me give you I want to give an example of that. So you might think, for example, in using liquid hydrogen, the trade-offs could be, maybe you care about energy efficiency, maybe you don't, but as an end user, you probably don't. If I'm an end user, I don't really care about the energy efficiency with which my hydrogen is made, unless I have to pay for it. Then I care, right? So I'm paying if I care. But one of the trade-offs can be, like, for example, energy efficiency would make it takes energy to liquefy hydrogen. And a weight trade-off could be, oh my God, I have to use this really super duper thermos bottle to hold my liquid hydrogen. It's like there's an internal stainless steel liner which holds the liquid hydrogen. Then there's material and vacuum insulation. And then I have an outer shell around that. It's like, how heavy is that thing? Okay, so that's an example of a trade-off. But a good thing is that it's incredibly pure hydrogen. So maybe I care about really, really pure hydrogen. All liquid hydrogen is like 5 nines pure. But I want to give you an example of a trade-off you may not know about. So it only makes the trade-off situation worse. So sorry about that. But here's a trade-off that you may not have thought about in using liquid hydrogen. When you're filling a liquid hydrogen tank, um, you have you have liquid kind of pouring in there, and if you know if it turns out that there's limits to how much you can fill it. You may not know about this, but in the marine world, the maritime world, if you have a liquid hydrogen tank on a boat, there are limits to how much you can fill it. And the reason is a trade-off, and this happens in liquid hydrogen and nothing else. So this is a trade-off just about liquid hydrogen, is that if the tank is sitting there, so it has liquid hydrogen in there, and the tanks are essentially pressure vessels because the liquid hydrogen is evaporating to form gaseous hydrogen. And you want the tank to be able to hold that pressure back, at least for a while. It turns out in maritime, it's like 2 weeks. So that's kind of a long time. So usually the pressure, they're like the pressure limit is like 150 psi or about 10 bar. So one of the problems with liquid hydrogen tank, which you have to consider because of the limitations of how it's used, is that the liquid in there, if there's heat coming into the thermos bottle, I like to think of them as thermos bottles, there's heat coming into the thermos bottle, the temperature of the liquid hydrogen goes up, it evaporates, the pressure is higher, the pressure in the gas phase is higher because you're not releasing the hydrogen yet. But higher pressures allow you to have the liquid stay a liquid, but at higher temperature. So you're evaporating hydrogen, the heat keeps coming in, the liquid is warming up, but staying a liquid. But like anything else that's absorbing heat, the liquid expands. The liquid is expanding, and you're just doing the same thing over again. You're putting the heat in it, the liquid's expanding, you're evaporating some of the hydrogen, the pressure's getting hotter, higher, which allows you to stay a liquid at higher temperatures, so you stay a liquid longer and longer. Anyway, the thing you have to avoid is that liquid hydrogen really expands a lot when you heat it up, even just like by 10 degrees. So you have to make sure that liquid charge doesn't create a liquid full condition in the tank, because then the pressures can go way up and it's can become a safety issue. So what's a limitation? So what's a trade-off? It turns out in the maritime space, depending on the way you can manage this issue is just you can only like 60% or 65% fill the tank. So you can only, if you have a volume of liquid hydrogen in the tank, you can only put like 65% full in there when you fill it up. That's a trade-off. So the reason I'm saying this is that I want the audience to know that how you actually use these things in real life can introduce trade-offs that are maybe bigger than the trade-offs you thought you had. Namely around, what's the storage, you can think of the storage density of between liquid hydrogen and high pressure hydrogen is, well, 40 grams per liter is 700 bar hydrogen versus 71 grams per liter for liquid. Okay. But you can only fill a liquid hydrogen tank half as much. Well, damn. So, and it can also come into the high pressure regime, because if you have a tank and you want to fill it, say you have a 700 bar tank of hydrogen on something, maybe it's a truck you have, or it's a car, or even a boat, and you can ask yourself, well, how am I going to get hydrogen to that thing? How am I getting hydrogen to that tank? You say, well, how do I get the hydrogen? And it turns out that hydrogen is being transported a lot by trailers, which have typically high pressure tanks in them. And you do something called a cascade fill, where you bring this trailer, which has all these tanks, 15 tanks, you open up one tank and the gas kind of goes in, close it off, you open up another tank, the gas goes in. Well, you can only kind of get about half of the amount of hydrogen that's in that trailer into your tank, depending on the relative volume. So you may have to pay for more than one trailer to come, because they typically do this cascade filling. So the reason I'm mentioning this is I'm oozing like an amoeba into these different things. The amoeba has to ooze into how it's actually used, and the trade-offs get worse.
Yeah.
So the only thing I can say is you have to look at all of them. And some trade-offs may not be so bad. For example, weight is a killer for aviation. I mean, For I'll say for aeronautics, say for launch, like launch vehicles, the Saturn, the for launching rockets into space, the weight of the fuel and its tank is 70% of the weight of the whole thing. It just is. That makes aeronautics hypersensitive to weight. You might think boats are maybe also weight sensitive because the boat can't sink. But it turns out as a percentage of the overall weight of a boat, the fuel and its storage is not as big a percentage like it is for aeronautics. Maybe it's 7% or something like that, 5%. So it's not as weight sensitive. So as you're doing your oozing into these different areas of trade-offs, which is unpleasant because usually it's a problem. There are problems. You have to think about how weight sensitive your application is. You have to think about the availability of the fuel that your storage system requires. You have to think about if you're really concerned about the emissions, what are the overall emissions associated with that storage path? And I mentioned that for ammonia, you can have more emissions because you're already starting with hydrogen to make the ammonia. And so the emissions are going to be higher. So I wish it was easier than that, but it's not.
Okay.
You have to really look at these trade-offs broadly.
Talking about trade-offs. Difficulties in accepting trade-offs have led to electrolyzer challenges in today's projects. It's not a matter of plug and play, it's more plug and pray. This is a very funny comment, but true, from Paul McCormack. And we already had an interview on Energy News, as I remember, with him.
Okay. I'm guessing what he's referring to, but Bill, correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, just put something into the chat saying Lenny's wrong. Is that it's around the reliability.
Yeah.
And so this is an area where I don't really have firsthand experience in it. I'm not really an expert in electrolyzers and saying like what their failure rate is. I'm guessing, this is just a guess, that PEM electrolyzers probably fail in the same way that PEM fuel cells fail. That is the membrane, which is I think of it more naturally in a fuel cell. The membrane allows the hydrogen to get oxidized and the oxygen to get reduced, but the membrane allows ion conduction between the two to complete the circuit. And if you run a fuel cell in reverse, it's kind of like an electrolyzer. So if that PEM membrane, what that does for you is it separates the half reactions so you can control the chemistry better, and also in the case of a fuel cell, get power out of the thing. There's a couple things that can screw up that membrane. One is it can develop pinholes, so that instead of only allowing ions to do their completing the circuit purpose, you can get crossover of the fuel. Like you get just hydrogen crossing over to oxygen, and then that screws things up. So there's a pinhole, can be a pinhole issue, which I don't know if that's the limiter for PEM membrane devices, but it certainly can be an issue. The other thing is these electrolyzers also have catalysts in them, which help the dissociation of water into hydrogen and oxygen. And impurities in the water can cause problems, but usually the specs for the specs on water for electrolyzers isn't really that difficult to achieve. I was involved in one project. We actually didn't end up deploying the electrolyzer, but we certainly had to make sure the water source was clean enough, but we had to do the testing for it. But it didn't seem like city water seems to be pretty good and good enough for it. But I have heard that there have been projects with different electrolyzer companies, and I won't really mention who they are, but where there have been reliability problems, and I'm not sure the technical reason for it, or there may be like a balance of plant reason for some. These things are complicated. There's water flow, there's gas flow, you're handling the output of hydrogen usually to feed it into a compressor, so you have to manage that flow and pressure a little bit. So there are these other what I call mechanical contrivances, but they're mechanical components that have to work. In a fuel cell, it's not just the fuel cell stack. You have usually power conditioning electronics that produce the power you want, for example. So sometimes the reliability can be tied to non-hydrogen or even non-fuel cell or non-electrolyzer stack issues. And I don't know if the problems that have been seen in electrolyzers can be associated with those. I'm not close enough to it. But I know that in fuel cells, the balance of plant stuff, that's the coolant for the PEM fuel cell, the power conditioning electronics, those things can go wrong and screw up everything in a way that's unrelated to the hydrogen technology. So I wish I had more direct experience with electrolyzers and a deeper knowledge of the failure. Although I've heard about them, I'm just not completely. And I think I've identified the likely culprits for how these electrolyzers may not be working well. I don't know if one more than the other is to blame. So that's about all I can say about it.
We are now at 1 hour and almost 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm happy to keep going.
Time flies.
Time flies when you're having fun, Arnaz. These are great questions.
Definitely.
I'm
Yeah.
happy to stay if people are happy to keep talking about it.
It's our purpose to get their questions to you. How do certain materials improve the hydrogen storage process, and why do some materials not work as expected?
Yeah, it's so I used to have a lot more hair, Arnaz, before I got into the hydrogen storage business, and you see what it's done to me. So these materials are not. The materials are not. I sleep pretty well at night, but I'm losing my hair. It's. I mentioned the 7 deadly sins of hydrogen storage, like the ways they can go wrong. They're too heavy. They don't kinetically behave well. They're not thermodynamically right. They're too expensive. They don't cycle. They release things other than hydrogen. And then there's the last one, which is escaping me. But so just to remind myself, the question was, why are these materials not working, or what's the problem?
Yeah, why do some materials work as expected and some not?
I think the reason goes into this chemistry question. I'm going to make some kind of generalizations, but the interstitial metal hydrides, which are too heavy, are just too heavy because you're using heavy elements. That's why. Otherwise, they're great. But it's really most of this, and there has been a lot of historical research in interstitial metal hydrides, but kind of the one which I've been more focused on has been in these lighter ones. Like we use lighter metals like sodium and sodium aluminum hydride, or lithium and magnesium in this amide material I mentioned, lithium amide plus magnesium hydride and magnesium borohydride. Again, those are all light. And I would say the thing that's about these materials that is the most troublesome, which causes them not to work, is that they're covalent. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the bonds in them are very directional. In a interstitial metal hydride, like the hydrogen dissociates into hydrogen atoms and just goes like in between the metal atoms. It's not like any particular atom is bonding to the hydrogen. It just kind of sits in the crevices of the thing. But in these very light materials, they're very covalent, which means that you have very direct bonds between hydrogen and maybe the boron, or hydrogen and the nitrogen, or hydrogen and the aluminum. And what happens is that when you have these, and most of our experience with chemicals are with covalent chemicals like water, H2O. You have a hydrogen bound to oxygen. That's a covalent material, covalent liquid. Um, Ammonia is a covalent material, NH3. It's very specific where the bonds are. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because what happens is that it increases the likelihood of intermediates, which is a problem in these hydrogen storage materials. That is, like for example, in magnesium borohydride, you start off with BH4. And what happens in these very covalent materials is that if you get a hydrogen off, which is what you want to get a hydrogen off and maybe it finds another hydrogen and comes off as a gas, you have this thing left over that's like BH3 that tends to be reactive. And if you have another like BH4 that lost its hydrogen over here, and you have this BH3 now, you have two of these things formed, sometimes they can just stick together. And when they stick together, they form something that typically is maybe even more stable than what you started with. And it makes it even harder to get can form very stable compounds that don't like to release the hydrogen that's still on there. So these covalent materials, the fact that you have very directional bonding, and when you get some hydrogen off, they tend to like react together and form new chemical compounds, which I'm calling intermediates. Intermediates because they're kind of intermediate between what you had and just getting all the hydrogen off. They're intermediate between that. This covalency is a problem, and it causes intermediates which rob you of the hydrogen that you're trying to get off. It tends to hold on to the hydrogen too much. And also it tends to make the required temperatures higher. Because these directional bonds, because you have like a nitrogen tightly holding onto a hydrogen or a boron tightly holding onto a hydrogen, it tends to take more energy to get the hydrogen off. Just like it takes a lot of energy to get the hydrogen off of water when you're electrolyzing it. That HO bond is pretty strong. The HN bond is also pretty strong, and HB bonds or H boron bonds are strong because they're very directional and well formed. So if I had to pick one thing that makes the lighter metal hydrides not work, it's the fact that they're kind of covalent materials. And that comes about because the metal atoms in them are light and they're more prone to forming these covalent materials. So that this covalency causes problem with too high temperature release. It can form a problem with your material going away because some of these residual chemicals which are left behind can be volatile, like B2H6, which has unfortunately hydrogen in it, is also volatile, and it can make your boron leave your hydrogen storage material. So if I had to say one thing about these materials, hydrogen storage solid state materials I'm talking about, is this covalency, which makes them more stable than you'd like. And I think this is also true for liquid organic hydrogen carriers, because people have looked at these liquids, which I call liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And if anybody's interested in this, as just an introduction to the topic, I can show you. So I published this book about 12 years ago, which we'll put in the bibliography, Hydrogen Storage Technology. And it goes into all these hydrogen storage issues circa 2012. So this covalency also affects the liquids, because the idea in a liquid organic hydrogen carrier is that you have something that has hydrogen in it, like cyclohexane, which is C6H12. So it's got a lot of hydrogen in it. And then you chemically convert that to get like some of the hydrogens off. And you can convert cyclohexane to benzene, which is C6H6. Well, you got rid of 6 of the hydrogen. That's good. You did good. But you can't get the hydrogens off of that benzene. It's very difficult, the C6H6. So that's where this covalent chemical bond maybe lets you get some of the hydrogen off, but not all of it. And it makes the energy requirements kind of difficult to get that hydrogen off more than you'd like. So while there can be very specific reasons for why a particular type of material may not work good, like for example, I already mentioned aluminum trihydride, or Alane is AlH3. perfect for releasing hydrogen, but you can't get the hydrogen back on very easily. That's a very specific problem with that material. I'd say as a higher level problem, it's the covalency or the tendency of these lighter materials to form very directional bonds, which make it difficult to get the hydrogen on and off.
Next question. How important is the type of bond between the materials in improving hydrogen storage efficiency?
Yeah, so I kind of just alluded to it. That bond it's everything, pretty much. You you try to stay away from. So there's a type of bond called ionic bonding. That's where. Excuse me, I'm just take a quick drink here from my Munich mug. I don't know if we have anybody from Munich on the line, but there's Munich right there. It turns out you want to stay away from ionic bonds. So an ionic bond, what's an ionic bond? An ionic bond is when you have a bond between two ions. So an example of this is lithium hydride. So lithium hydride has hydrogen in it. So all the one filter RNS hydrogen storage has to get through. It has to have hydrogen in it. That's the one thing it has to have, right? So lithium hydride, LiH, is a hydrogen storage material. It's not a very good one. Why is it not a good one? Because the lithium, the chemistry, lithium really likes to grab electrons or likes to give up electrons, and hydrogen likes to actually grab them. So what you form is a lithium plus and an H minus. And those two, because positive attracts negative, they stick together and it's pretty tight. To get hydrogen off of lithium hydride, you have to heat it to 500 centigrade. You have to heat it way, way higher. Can you do it? Yes. Can you get the hydrogen off of lithium hydride? Yes. But you typically don't want to be heating something so hot to get that hydrogen off. So you want to avoid what are called ionic bonds in these materials. And so intermediates, which are ionic in nature, are a real problem because, man, they just hold on to the hydrogen with grim death, like with a kung fu grip, like a kung fu grip harness. Some of those metal atoms will just hold on to it through ionic bonding. So what you really want is kind of a weakened covalent bonding. I already mentioned covalent bonds can be strong too, like the bond in water, H2O. That's a strong covalent bond. But that strong covalent bond is the reason why you have to dump twice as much energy into the electrolysis of water than you do lower heating value of hydrogen out. But that's too strong covalent bond. What you really want is like kind of a weak covalent bond, and that's where you can kind of affect the situation through the use of additives, like low levels of additives, like even lithium or even potassium is shown to be an interesting additive. At low levels, can sometimes disrupt this bonding to the point where it kind of eases the conditions of getting hydrogen off. Another way around it is to go small, and that is some of these materials in their bulk, like by bulk, I mean like even a micron-sized particle is a bulk material. So a micron is very small, a micrometer.
Yeah.
But if you can make it small, and I mean like into the nano scale regime, nanometers, like 10 nanometers, 20 nanometers, what can often happen is that even though you still have sort of the same thing, the same molecule, when it's made very small, some of these bonds are much more at the surface, just by virtue of it being very small. You have more atoms at the surface, and that can disrupt the bonding in these materials. So going small can either mean making the particle specifically into a nanoparticle, or you can get the material into a pocket that's small. So there's a class of chemical hosts we call them nanoscaffolds, or that where you can actually introduce these hydrogen storage materials into a very small pocket, which makes it small, maybe 10 nanometers or 3 nanometers or 5 nanometers. And what we can find is that some of the difficulties associated with these hydrogen storage materials are relieved Now, this host, this scaffold if you're worried about weight, has to be light. And it also kind of takes up some of the volumetric space, because if the scaffold is just like this, like, can think of it as a holy sponge. It takes up space, which you may not like, but by getting to these small scales, you can change the chemistry of these materials. That's an active area of research that I've done work in. They can even, this going small can even change the tendency of intermediates to form, because in this material system, which I mentioned, lithium amide, LiNH2 plus LiH, typically that material, you only get some of the hydrogen off because you stop at an intermediate called an imide, which is, instead of LiNH2, which you started with, you just form LiNH. So some of the H is still stuck there. What we found out, and I'll put this paper in the bibliography, is that if you make that system small, you avoid completely forming this intermediate, and you get all the hydrogen out of it. And we think it has to do with the stability of these intermediate phases relative to each other as things get small. So again, it's kind of a long answer, but there's some strategies for getting past the problems which exist in the bulk materials, which can often be traced to too strong covalency.
We will take a short break and continue with questions.
Okay. How long a break, Ryan? That's about 5 minutes or so, or 10 minutes? Or?
Yeah, we'll have about 1 minute.
1
If you
minute?
need more, if you
Might give me a
need
few
more,
minutes. Might give me a few minutes. I just want to microwave some water here. But these are
Guys,
great questions. Keep asking. This is really very interesting for me to hear what people are curious about. So thank you for that. Thank you.
We're going back in a few minutes.
I'll be right back.
NextAI Booster is a scale-up program that helps early-stage, most promising startups focusing on green hydrogen scale their solution at industrial level.
Power to Hydrogen is one of the first startups that we collaborate with out of the NextAI Booster program.
We make electrolyzers that can produce green hydrogen. What it does is it just takes water and electricity and it makes hydrogen. Our technology is specifically designed to pair well with renewable energy and do it better.
This is a great example of a collaboration with the startups that had a great idea, had a proof of concept already, like on a small scale.
The next step is to scale it up and build a bigger version that can go out to renewable sites and plug in to the renewable energy and generate hydrogen there.
This is what I see as opportunity within NextAI Booster program. You have the chance to really validate the technology with experts, with an and with scientific partners. We can always give them the expertise that we have.
Be involved in a project like this and seeing that this will be a reality and be part of this is completely something amazing.
Collaborating at this level is also exciting because this company is doing something very new. The only way is to have big collaboration, the only way to make real innovation.
We know that we cannot do this alone, and that's the whole concept of the open innovability. We want to be part of it because we know it's bigger than everybody.
We are always pursuing innovation, so it has to be done together.
And as we are waiting for Lenny to come back, there are some new things happening on the energynews.biz, and you can pick it up. Since a few weeks ago, we're started to publish hydrogen industry related patents and also hydrogen science articles paired with tenders related to hydrogen in Europe. So you're welcome to go to Energy News Biz and check those out. Lenny, welcome back.
Thank you, Ernest.
Refreshed and ready
Yeah.
for the next question.
Mhm.
We are going to poll again. Electrolyzer response to intermittent renewables is troublesome. We're looking at innovation in plates, bonds, and membranes to overcome those problems. What are your thoughts on developing responsive membranes?
So this is to make sure I understand the question. Before I say I don't know anything about it. So basically it sounds like you're coupling an electrolyzer to intermittent sources like solar or wind-based power. So I'm actually interested in the questioner clarifying what the problem actually is. So is the problem that the electrolyzer, the time response of the electrolyzer is not tracking um, sort of the time constant associated with wind? Maybe the wind is more than solar. I think wind might be more intermittent in time. So is the problem that the electrolyzer is not responsive enough to that time variation in wind? Maybe Paul can put something in the chat about that. Is that kind of the issue? Because I know with solar the variations are much slower, but with wind it's can be very erratic. Am I thinking about it right, Paul?
Yeah, Paul, please follow up. And until he does, you can start answering.
I just want to make sure I'm thinking about it right.
Or we can also come back to this question.
Yeah, why don't we assume that? Let's assume that I'm thinking about it right. So wind,
Yeah.
again, wind can be very erratic. There's no question about it. It's up and down, and I think so. The question I think is around that
Here is the explanation. The problems in ramp-up response and shock to the membranes which shorten lifespan, especially in wind systems. And you were right about the winds.
So it's turning on and off. It's kind of like turning on and off. So I have to say that I know nothing about so I don't have any direct experience with how electrolyzers are coupled to wind resources. I'm imagining, though, that I like to think of it. So this may not help, Paul, but I'm just going to tell you what I think. There's a similar problem in fuel cells operation. That is, the time response of like a PEM fuel cell is on the order of seconds, and there are demands on power in different applications, particularly in ships, for example, where you have very high transients loads that can't be handled by a fuel cell. So you usually have a battery in there that handles the transient loads, and that's how they make it work. That's how they handle the problem of intermittency in fuel cells. So this is kind of the opposite problem. Is that you have an intermittent charging of your membrane, your electrolysis membrane from your intermittent source, and you're trying to produce hydrogen intermittently. And I could see that there would be shocks. It's sudden changes in ion current, the starting and stopping, that could be a problem. So I'm just wondering if and I don't know if this is true, but if electrolyzer units also have battery systems that can help smooth out, the battery systems are charged by your input source to the electrolyzer, and those battery systems act to smooth out those electricity source variations for you. it seems to me that would be a way to do it, but I don't know if they do it. Like I'm not that familiar with electrolysis units, so I don't know if they would do it. But that would be the first thing I would look to. Would be if the transients are, and they're probably pretty fast. I mean, it can be on the order of definitely fractions of a minute. A battery would help smooth that out. I think that would be a logical approach, but I just don't know if they're doing it. As far as the membrane themselves, there are people doing research in membranes. Actually, at Sandia, Sai Fujimoto is a Sandia scientist. I can definitely put some. He knows a lot about PEM membranes, and he could probably answer that better than me. So I could always put the questioner in touch with Sai, who'd be happy to answer that. So maybe RNS. I'll take a note here to put Sai Fujimoto in the
We will
more
distribute
helpful, but
this.
does
post the
that,
show.
Paul, does that, maybe I could just ask Paul this question. Does he know if electrolyzer companies use ramps like that? I actually could make a mobile shout out. I actually have a friend who I could probably call and ask this question in real time, but I think maybe I won't, just because of, it's a little awkward. But I'm thinking it can be smoothed out with batteries, but I'm not sure if they do it. I don't know if maybe we'll just move on, but I think I've exhausted all I have to say about that. But the more I think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my friends who work in the electrolysis business and ask them what they do about that. And we can put, Arnes, why don't we put that, maybe we can put that response in the bibliography.
Yeah.
I can maybe you could even write like a short document on it. Response to intermittent wind, and we could put something in the bibliography. Maybe I could get a good answer to it.
Yeah. So
yep. So thank you, Paul, for that. Thank you for definitely for the cold start. You have to do it, but I'm wondering if it's specifically for handling transient wind sources. But we'll see. I'll find out.
Okay. Going to the next.
Thank you, Paul, for that question. That was really good.
How has computer modeling helped understand the best ways to store hydrogen, and what are the limitations?
This is an interesting question. Let me think about this for a moment. I know of a way in the material space, but I'm trying to think more broadly if there's. I would say probably. Well, it depends on what you mean by computer modeling. When, for example, in the maritime area where we're contemplating using hydrogen on boats, naval architects use computer modeling all the time to construct 3D renderings of a vessel and to make sure where everything is and that and understand the weight implications. So certainly there's computer models associated with that in naval architecture, for example. And I think in any technical field where you're going to be using hydrogen fuel cells, there's some modeling that goes into the end use. But I don't think that's really what the question was asking about. There's also a lot of computer modeling in the behavior of cryogenic tanks and understanding their performance. For example, I'll go back to the liquid hydrogen example. Liquid hydrogen tanks work better mounted horizontally than vertically. But maybe people didn't know that, but it's actually true. It's not a huge difference, but it's a difference, and it's a noticeable difference. And the reason for that is that when a tank is vertical, the heat is coming from the sides, so the heat ingresses from the sides. So what happens is that in the vertical tank, you can get a warming of the liquid hydrogen relative to what it is in the center, and they call it an elevator, a thermal elevator. You get this less dense liquid hydrogen rising up, and it kind of gets to the top, and then you can actually get like a recirculation pattern built up, which isn't as strong as when they're mounted horizontally. So that's an example. That's studied with modeling. So the performance can be modeling based. A very interesting use of modeling in hydrogen technology is to understand the heating limits with which you can compress gas into a hydrogen tank. Now, this requires a little bit of an explanation. So when you fill a high pressure hydrogen tank, I already mentioned the kind of the bicycle pump example. You're squishing, working hard to squish that hydrogen in there, and the gas heats up. And it may be that you're in a high pressure tank whose weight you don't care about, and like it's just a carbon steel tank, and you don't really care too much about the temperature. But there's some hydrogen tanks where you really do care about the temperature, and these are the composite hydrogen tanks. So there's a class of hydrogen tank that's been built up that is meant to be light. So the way these things are typically made is that a composite hydrogen tank can have a metal, typically aluminum inner liner, which they call, it's a type 3 tank. And to make that aluminum more strong to hold back the high pressure, what they'll do is they'll wrap it with carbon composite. That's called a composite tank, or composite overwrap tank. And that like doubles the pressure rating of the tank. But it turns out there's an epoxy they use in that, which can be temperature sensitive. So as you're filling this tank, which if you're using a composite tank has this epoxy on the outside, you can't let the temperature get too high in the tank. And so you have to know how quickly you can put hydrogen in that tank and what the temperature limit is. For a type 4 tank, which actually has a plastic inner liner, the temperature limit is about 82 degrees centigrade. For a type 3 tank, which has an aluminum liner, it's a little bit higher rating, and they've gone to some higher temperature epoxies, but it's still, you can't get above like around 120 centigrade. So where modeling comes into play is that there's computational fluid dynamics modeling that's been applied to how fast you can fill these tanks. And it's been and they're pretty good models in the sense that they've been validated against experiment. And that's where modeling really can come into play for hydrogen storage, is to develop the fueling protocols for different tanks. And I've been involved in a project recently where we've done some of that modeling, and we have that modeling capability at Sandia. Finally, there's one area I'd like to talk about, and that is using machine learning programs to predict the properties of new alloys. At Sandia, we have a staff member here, a scientist, Matt Whitman, who's an expert in this. And if the person is really interested in this particular aspect, I can always put them in touch with Matt. Machine learning is a computational scheme by which you can survey, you can sort of train the modeling with the properties of hydrogen storage materials, and it can then go a step further and actually look and predict the properties of hydrogen storage materials that either haven't been thought of or are new, or basically new in composition. And it lets you predict those properties quickly. This is a relatively new advancement in the hydrogen storage field in the past couple of years, I'd say, maybe longer, 3 years. And it seems to work pretty well in the sense that, and it's basically just been applied to alloys. I think alloys lend themselves better to this thing because usually the alloys are multi-component. Like the commercial alloys can have 4 or 5 different elements in them, all kind of tuning the properties thermodynamically to be what you want, but they're heavy. But the machine learning has actually been able to predict some new compositions that we at Sandia have actually made, synthesized, and found to be, I'd say, incremental improvements over the heavy metal hydrides. So just to sum up, computer modeling has been used to predict new materials by this machine learning. And Arnaz, maybe I'll make a note here to put Matt Whitman contact in the bibliography if there's interest. As computational fluid dynamics modeling has been used in understanding how to fill hydrogen tanks, CFD modeling has also been used to understand the dynamic properties of liquid hydrogen tanks. And also, I just want to mention, and I can put this in the bibliography too, and I think this is important. It's not quite what the questioner asked, but the modeling has really helped in understanding how the consequences of hydrogen release in different scenarios. For example, I've done a lot of work in ships, using hydrogen on ships. We've done computational fluid dynamics modeling, looking at what happens if there's an unanticipated or unintended hydrogen release in the room where fuel cells are being used. How does it behave? What kind of ventilation do you need? We've also done computational fluid dynamics modeling of hydrogen releases out of vent mass, because I mentioned before remember I mentioned that with like a liquid hydrogen tank, there's always some evaporation. And that, well, eventually, and I mentioned there's a pressure limit for the tank of 10 bar, 150 psi. Eventually, if you're not using the hydrogen, that lifts, and so you're venting hydrogen out of vent mass. We've studied what's the best way to do. We've studied not only how that what that looks like in terms of the flammability cloud, but also we've looked at how to do it better. So I say the computational modeling, both in the safety properties, how hydrogen releases behave, but also in materials discovery with this machine learning, and also just in the older technologies, but how you can use them and how they dynamically operate. There's been a lot of great work done in computational modeling.
What I can tell you is that shows with you are never short or boring. We are almost at 2 hours, so we will take one more question. Yeah.
That's amazing. It just feels like 30 minutes or something like that.
We are going again to Paul, and he's on fire today. Continuing the IT theme beyond machine learning, Lennie, what are your thoughts on developing digital twins to enhance operational efficiencies of balance of green hydrogen plant, and also for a rapid prototyping for electrolyzer plates and parts?
I don't know what a digital twin is. I don't know what a digital twin is, which might convey my understanding, my kind of basic hardcore science existence, maybe. Paul, can you tell me what a digital twin is? I mean, I think I could guess. Maybe it's, I really don't know. I don't know what a digital twin is, but maybe, Paul, if you could tell me what it is, I might be able to hazard a guess. But me even having to ask what a digital twin is may disqualify me, Paul. It's so lower me in your estimation of being able to answer it that'd be okay too, if that's how you felt.
Yeah.
Like, if you type never mind, that just means that I don't know what a digital twin is.
I can see that the Paul is really into the green hydrogen and renewables, so
yeah, good for him too.
I'm assuming that this will be mostly the wind in Ireland. Yeah, here is the digital twin, an IT model for machine learning.
An IT model for machine learning. So is that different than machine learning itself? I don't know. I don't know really enough about it.
Okay.
I mean, I think I know I barely know what machine learning is, because I mean, I know basically what it does, but it's the machine learning. It feels a little bit like an interpolation process where you train it with data, and then it kind of, English is a language of I agree with you, Paul. English is the language of differences. I'm just not an expert in that, what he's asking about. So I'm gonna say, I'm sorry, Paul, I just don't know.
Nah.
But Paul, I could put you in touch with Matt Whitman, who might be able to answer a question on it. So I'll make sure Matt's contact information is in the bibliography.
Yeah.
And feel free to contact these people. Sai Fujimoto in the area of membranes, Matt Whitman. We're very happy to talk to people.
We might do the live panel with them and you. So who knows? Yeah, that will. Then we will be able to answer all the hydrogen questions at once. I hope so.
That would be great.
I think we'll stop here. We are at 1 hour and 45 minutes. And thank you, Lennie. Thank you for everything today.
No, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed the questions. I think the audience was great. Really appreciate you inviting me to be part of this really wonderful process of if we didn't have the answers, we kind of figured it out between us, which was great. Between the audience and me, and we figured stuff out, I think, a little bit. And again, we'll put contact information in the bibliography. If there's anything more that comes to mind, feel free to, Ernest, they'll have my contact information, my email address, and
Yeah,
we'll make sure
for
that
sure.
that's available. And happy to talk to anybody about these things. And I may have an answer, maybe not, like in that last one. I kind of feel like I'd like to end on a one where I kind of feel like I'd like to end on one where I knew the answer. But do you have any questions, Ernest? Or do you have any residual questions?
No, if I start with the questions, we will finish till midnight,
Okay.
I think.
But anyway, I really enjoyed it. It just seems like it was 30 minutes. And so
Yeah.
this was just great. Thank you for inviting me. It was really
Really,
my pleasure.
thank you, and thanks to all our viewers today. They were really
Great
included.
questions.
Yeah, great questions and active.
Thanks
Okay.
for staying for 2 hours too. Really appreciate your time.
All right, you hydrogen hyped hooligans, we've squeezed every last brain cell Dr. Klebanoff had to offer, leaving you swimming in a sea of science and scribbled notes. Now it's time to unleash this hydrogen hype on the world. Don't let those neurons gather dust. Go forth and electrolyze. And remember, if your hydrogen balloon starts to deflate, don't be shy. We're not just one-stop shop for brainiac knowledge. We're a community. We are on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, basically everywhere except your therapist couch. Head over to our website. It has more hydrogen resources than you can shake a fuel cell at. Or if you're feeling lonely, email us at info@energynewsbiz. We're always up for a good hydrogen heart-to-heart. So
Absolutely.
go on, get out there, and show the world what you're made of. See you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ernest. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.